In this lecture, we will be looking at some of the critical discoveries and developments that have shaped psychological assessment as the practice we know today. While it would take some time to address each and every individual whose work propelled the field forward, we will spend some time discussing a few. In this session, we are going to start at the beginning and look at where and when assessment all began. From those early beginnings, we will look at how assessment practices have changed over time due to our expanding view of the mind and the human condition, advances in scientific inquiry, and the use of modern technology. Specifically, we will look at how our understanding of two dominant constructs, intelligence and personality, have changed over the past 100 years. Finally, we will look at where assessment seems to be going in the future. Assessment practices are by no means new. These practices have been found in written documents dating back thousands of years. For our discussion today, we will look at the assessment movement in three distinct phases. Ancient times, which will last up to the Middle Ages, ending in the 1500s. The emergence of the psychological laboratory in the late 1800s. And the modern clinical and educational uses we find in the 1900s and the 2000s. So let's begin in ancient times. One of the first documented examples of assessment practices is the Chinese use of educational and vocational assessments. These early writings date back to 2000 BCE. The Chinese used these exams and assessments as a way to classify individuals in society. Well, fast forward to the more modern conceptualizations of these exams by looking at the introduction of the Imperial Chinese Civil Service Examination beginning in the year 206 BCE. The imperial examination was used as a way to identify candidates who would be able to serve in the government and fill the myriad of governmental bureaucratic positions needed in the Chinese Empire. The examination itself was intense and grueling. It would last 72 hours, in which an individual would be placed in a testing room and forced to complete the exam. When first offered, it was very popular for individuals to want to take the exam, as obtaining one of these government positions in the Chinese Empire was a sign of status and also provided a lucrative living for individuals. In the earlier years, over 30,000 adults would sign up to take these tests. These examinations have continued for hundreds and thousands of years. During the Sui dynasty, from 581 to 618, the administration of the Imperial Civil Service Examination was revised. Now, greater access was provided to individuals seeking to take the examination. All young males, regardless of the social class from when they came, who desired to enter into bureaucracy and improve their societal standing, were able to take the exam. The Sui dynasty wanted to position their rule as equitable for all individuals, that anybody would be allowed to take the exam, and anybody would be allowed to improve their lot in life. However, equality was not really reality. Although everyone had the opportunity to take these tests, the wealthy families were the ones that were able to hire tutors and had the means to provide resources to help their children prepare for the examinations. Following the Sui dynasty, the Tang dynasty revised the content of the test. Now, there were separate tiers to the test, and individuals would have to perform at an exceptional level at each tier to be able to move on to the more advanced exams. Only the best of the best were able to move on to the top levels. These examinations continue in some form today. The Chinese imperial examination, as we're discussing now, was actually in place up to the 20th century. The examination in this form was fully abolished by the Chinese government in 1911. So we're looking at a period of nearly 4,000 years through which examinations and assessments were used to place individuals into different career paths. Now today there is a similar process in place where Chinese residents can gain access to public service jobs, and now it's open to all individuals, men and women, who are interested in working in government positions. In 2019, 1.4 million people applied to take the civil service examination. These individuals were vying for one of 24,000 available jobs into which they could be placed, giving individuals a 1 in 60 chance. These examinations covered several different areas. The early imperial examination covered these 8 areas. Individuals had to excel in writing, in calligraphy, in formal essay writing, which included meticulously following standards and techniques, classical literature, mathematics, legal matters, government matters, poetry, and clear and coherent speaking. Individuals who wanted to obtain one of these highly coveted governmental jobs also needed to demonstrate moral turpitude and personal character. The young men who were taking these tests had to present themselves as worthy and upright. Certain males were excluded from taking these examinations. Men who came from families where they were slaves, actors, criminals, or children of prostitutes were not eligible to test. Because of the rigor of the test, most individuals never completed the examination. Of those who did complete it, only about 1% of all examinees pass. For those who were optimistic, there was the possibility to retake the examination an unlimited number of times. Here is an illustration of the Imperial Examination Testing Chamber. Individuals were placed in small rooms or cells that they would test in. And as I mentioned earlier, they would stay in here for 72 hours. The room was fashioned in such a way that their desk and bench, as you see on the right, could be repositioned to create a bed for rest during the examination period. A second example that we see of assessment practices emerging in ancient times is in Greece. In ancient Greece, we have documented accounts of assessment practices being used for educational pursuits. According to Plato, education was a means of achieving justice, both at an individual and a societal level. According to Plato, individual justice was obtained when each individual was able to develop his or her ability to the fullest. As such, Socrates and Plato were strong advocates for careful consideration in career placements. The idea being, if we could identify where individuals were likely to excel and where their interests and abilities lie, we would provide a pathway forward for success for that individual. They believed that individuals' career choices should be dictated by their demonstrated abilities and aptitudes. In his writings, Plato talked about virtue being obtained through 3 stages of development of knowledge. These 3 stages include knowledge of one's own job, knowledge of self, and knowledge of the idea of good. We see a lot of the foundational beliefs of trait and factor theory in Plato's writings. An individual knowing about the world of work, what it takes to succeed and perform at a certain level in a specified career path, coupled with an individual's knowledge of themselves, their abilities, aptitudes, interests, values, and goals. The convergence of that leads to successful career. Couple that with a knowledge of the idea of good, what benefits society, and we have an ideal situation, according to Plato. In Plato's Republic, he talks about the importance of society being able to exercise strict control over the content of everything that children read, see, or hear. If we are to create a society, an educated society, we need to control what it is that individuals are having access to. Plato goes on to say that society then should be designing educational systems. And those systems should have a mechanism in place that would distinguish future citizens based on their functions and abilities. And that individuals would then be directed into various career training paths appropriate to their abilities. Plato saw this type of educational system as a form of social justice, where all individuals in all social classes, whether they be workers, warriors, or politicians were able to live in a harmonious relationship. That harmony exists because everyone was given an equal educational opportunity from an early age to compete fairly with one another. Once their interests and aptitudes began to develop, that training became specialized, and individuals were able to excel in career paths that aligned with their interests. So now we will fast forward and we'll look at the ending of the Middle Ages. And I want to specifically look at the influence of the Christian church. So in the 1500s, a sect of the Christian church, the Jesuits, were using assessment and testing extensively in their academic programs. In their educational endeavors, they began using written examinations, an early precursor of standardized testing movements. During the Middle Ages, the practice du jour was oral assessment. In all educational pursuits and vocational training pursuits, assessment and examination occurred through oral defense or oral responses to questions. This was the case because literacy was the exclusive privilege of nobility and the clergy. With the Jesuits beginning to use written examinations, they were able to maintain this exclusivity, and they were using examinations as a means of social control. Those who did not have access to the resources needed or the training needed to be able to learn to read and write were unable to take these examinations. Their approach caught on and became quite popular across European higher education institutes. Some of the earliest colleges and universities developing in the 1500s and 1600s began using this written examination policy. The standardized testing movement also found its way in the United States. In the 1840s, Horace Mann was recommending the use of standardized written tests and petitioned the Boston public school system to replace its annual oral exams with a standardized written test. With the switch to written examinations, a change in the purpose and intent of assessment also took place. Tests were now being designed to assess a person's ability, not just their achievement. Standardized tests were looking at predicting the future more so than they were grading past learning and prior knowledge. The goal then was to not only identify those students who would be most successful in higher education or certain vocational pursuits, but also to identify the best teaching methods. How were those individuals who were scoring the best on these standardized tests taught? What was it about their educational experiences that may have contributed to their success? If we as a society are able to identify those teaching methods that produce the best students, then they could be replicated across schools, in school districts across the country. So those were some of the earlier developments in assessment, which we look at as our ancient times. I now want to shift our focus to the second period, the laboratory dominance stage. The laboratory period was a time when we start to see a emergence of scientific inquiry related to psychological concepts and understandings. In 1879, Wilhelm Wundt founded the first laboratory for psychological research at the University of Leipzig in Germany. Wundt, at the time, had a background in physiology, and he specialized in research looking at sensory processes and attention. His goal was to help differentiate psychology from philosophy. Taking a scientific structured approach using the scientific method to record thoughts, images, and sensations, and then parse them into their constituent elements, we were now seeing a way of psychology being a standalone science. Now, at his laboratory, Wundt trained many students. In fact, in the time that he was working, he trained 116 psychology graduate students, many who would go on to have a meaningful impact on the field for years to come. Among some of his students are G. Stanley Hall, James McKean Cattell, Charles Spearman, Hugo Munsterberg, and Edward Titchener. If you have a psychology background, you may recognize some of these names, as their works have led to the development of such specialized areas as educational psychology, clinical psychology, industrial organizational psychology, and experimental psychology. One of Wundt's students, G. Stanley Hall, would go on to start the first psychological laboratory in the United States at Johns Hopkins University. While at Johns Hopkins University, he would create his own team of doctoral students, and at one point he was the supervising professor for 11 of the first 14 doctorates in psychology awarded in the United States. Following his time at Johns Hopkins, Dr. Hall would go on to be the president of Clark University in Atlanta. It was at Clark University that he invited several prominent psychoanalysts to come speak. Among them, Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. This visit to Clark University was Freud's only visit to the United States. So here are some illustrations of what these early psychological laboratories look like. And so here are some images of Wundt and his students. And this is what their laboratories looked like. They were doing, again, many sensory perception studies, trying to identify minute differences in individuals. Additional images of Wundt and his student G. Stanley Hall. On the left is the photograph taken at Clark University. Seated in the front with Hall in the middle is Sigmund Freud on the left and Carl Jung on the right. Another famous graduate from the psychological laboratory at the University of Leipzig is James McKeen Cattell. Cattell graduated from the university in 1886 and would go on to become the first psychology professor in the United States at the University of Pennsylvania. Again, the work that was going on in Germany and starting in the United States with Hall in his laboratory was positioning psychology as its own standalone science and degree. Now, prior to coming to the United States to take his faculty appointment at University of Pennsylvania, Cattell spent time in London working with Sir Francis Galton. While working with Galton, he became enamored with some of his ideas and beliefs, as well as those ideas of his cousin, Charles Darwin, who was developing his theory of evolution. Francis Galton, who coined the term nature versus nurture to identify differences between innate characteristics that we are born with and that are passed down through heredity versus the influence of our environment and social upbringing and who we become. In addition to that term, Sir Francis Galton coined the term eugenics. In 1883, Galton began working on eugenics inside as a moral philosophy and a social need to improve humanity by encouraging the ablest and healthiest people to have more children. This approach is going to factor into many of the assessment-related activities we'll talk about coming up. Cattell was also the first to coin the term mental test. So his work, founding from this idea of being able to identify those traits or characteristics that are most desirable and most likely to lead to success, and then trying to hone in on those, led him to develop a mental test, a way that we could identify who was the individuals that had these superior genetics and superior attributes. So the mental test was actually a series of 10 smaller tests that measured a variety of sensations, reaction times, memory, and spatial processing abilities. Here are the 10 subtests that were on Cattell's initial mental test. The first, dynamometer pressure, was looking at the strength of a person's hand grip. The rate of hand movement was measuring how quickly a person could move their hand across a span of 50 centimeters. The 2-point threshold was when the test used a rubber-tipped compass, and the researcher was trying to find the smallest distance at which the tips were felt by the subject as two separate points. The pressure-causing pain test was when an instrument was pressed against the person's forehead with an increasing amount of force, and the individual would signal when pain would begin to be felt. The weight differentiation test required an individual to look at a set of identical looking boxes that differed in weight and to select which was the heavier of the two. Reaction time for sound measured the brief period that elapsed between when a sound was made and the time when a person's muscles started reacting to it. The time for naming colors. The researcher provides a set of red, yellow, green, and blue patches of color in random order and measures how long it takes the individual to name the color they're seeing. In the bisection of line test, a 50 centimeter strip of wood with a sliding line is attached. The person is asked to place the line as close as possible to the exact middle of the strip. The researcher then measures how accurate the person's estimate was. In the judgment of time, the examiner would tap out a 10-second interval on a table, and then the individual taking the test was asked to signal when another 10 seconds had passed, and subsequently every 10 seconds after that. And then finally, the number of repeated letters. In this test, the researcher was assessing how well a person could repeat a list of random consonants. So Cattell saw these mental tests as being the definitive way to identify those individuals who had the aptitude for success. These would be the individuals who had the superior genetic makeup that would allow them to excel in an educational setting as well as in their vocational careers. It was actually one of Cattell's students, Clark Kistler, who conducted his dissertation on the mental tests and found no statistical relationship between mental test scores and academic performance. So how individuals performed on Cattell's mental test had no relationship to how they performed in school. Individuals who did well on the mental tests were just as likely to perform well in school and poorly in school. This research began being replicated at different locations with different groups of individuals, and soon Cattell's mental tests fell out of favor as a reliable and valid way of identifying students who had a high likelihood of success. An interesting fact, Kistler, in doing his dissertation study, was actually using a new statistical technique called the correlation coefficient. So you're familiar with that from your statistics classes. The correlation coefficient was developed by Carl Pearson, who is actually one of Francis Galton's students. And Galton, of course, was the individual who worked with and influenced much of Cattell's tests and ideas. So now we'll move into the modern times. And so when I speak of modern times, we're looking at the 1900s on forward. By this point, we have seen a movement whereby assessment was being used to differentiate and separate people into groups. One of the first applications we see of this is in France. In the early 1900s, the French government saw an inundation of challenges in their school systems. There were a great many students who struggled academically, and as a result, made the learning environment difficult for all students. As a result, the French government commissioned Binet to develop an instrument that they could use to identify school children who needed remedial studies. Simon was the individual who Binet would work with. Together, they set out to create this intelligence scale. At the time, few other researchers and scientists were willing to take on such a task. What Binet and Simon did was come up with a list of items that they could use to separate individuals who were likely to be successful and those who were not. One of Binet's students at the time volunteered to help collect data from Parisian school children to develop their norm group. This student was Jean Piaget, who has gone on to create his own idea of early childhood development. When word got out that Binet and Simon were creating this instrument, proponents of the eugenics movement were excited. They were excited that there may soon be a test that they could use that would early on identify feeble-minded individuals. The belief was that once these feeble-minded individuals were identified, they should be discouraged from reproducing and allowed to have offspring. So the initial Binet-Simon scale included 30 items, and it was drawn from previous research that they had been conducting, drawing in from some of the research that was coming from the psychological laboratories on what characteristics differentiated individuals. It was also drawn from the educational curriculum being taught at many of the Parisian schools. In the initial scoring of the instrument, there was no single score representative of an individual's intelligence. Binet himself did not believe that his psychometric instruments should be used to measure a single permanent inborn level of intelligence. In fact, he was one of the greatest critics of his own instrument. He stressed that there were several limitations to his test, and that the concept of intelligence was far too broad to be able to quantify with a single number. He believed that his instrument provided one piece of data that could be used in understanding intelligence. Despite criticism from its own developer and creator, the Binet-Simon test became quite popular. In the 1910s, Louis Terman, who was working at Stanford University, joined the project and would revise the scale and standardize the test with subjects drawn from an American sample. His new version of the test became known as the Stanford Binet Intelligence Test. This intelligence test is still used today and is one of the most widely used intelligence tests. In addition to norming the instrument on an American sample and revising some of the content, Terman addressed some of the individuals who were most excited about this work and what it could do by creating the intelligence quotient. The intelligence quotient, or IQ, now provided a metric or a score that an individual could have and carry as either a badge of honor or a curse. That intelligence quotient represents the individual's ability to carry on abstract thinking. The Stanford Binet test, in its current iteration, looks at 6 different areas: general intelligence, fluid reasoning, knowledge, quantitative reasoning, visual spatial reasoning, and working memory. These 6 areas coalesce to provide a single score, an intelligence quotient, which looks at a ratio of an individual's mental age divided by their chronological age. Here you see the scoring for the Stanford Binet exam and the classification of where one would be placed. The instrument is normed with a mean of 100, and so an average score is between 90 and 109. And you can see how individuals fall as their score extends beyond the average or falls below the average. Excited about the possibilities of being able to identify, differentiate, and categorize individuals in school systems, the idea of intelligence testing branched out into other applications as well. In the 1910s, there was the growing tensions across the globe, which ultimately led to World War breaking out. With the war beginning, the United States military needed a screening tool. The tool had 2 dual purposes. First, they wanted to be able to identify who should be in the military and who should not. And then, of those being admitted to the military, who were the ones that should be the soldiers and who were the ones that would be the officers. The idea behind these screenings is that those individuals with higher intellectual abilities, who were stronger thinkers, reasoners, and able to use mental abilities, were the ones who were going to be placed into officer training. They had the tactical minds to develop the strategies that would be used in battle. Those individuals with lesser intellectual abilities were relegated to the ranks of foot soldiers, who would make up many of the frontline soldiers going into battle. To create this instrument, the government reached out to Robert Yerkes, who was the first American Psychological Society president, and several of his colleagues. They were commissioned to develop two screening devices, the Army Alpha and the Army Beta tests. The Army Alpha test was based on group intelligence tests being developed by Arthur Otis. Otis was at Stanford when Lewis Terman was beginning to revise the Binet-Simon scale into what would become the Stanford-Binet intelligence test. Otis believed that there were opportunities to have group intelligence tests, which would be far more economical and logistically convenient to sample large groups of individuals at a time. The Army Alpha test was based on this approach, as the military would be needing to test thousands of recruits and potential recruits at a time to get them battle ready. Here's an example of the Army Alpha test. So as you can see, content covers a variety of areas, looking at individuals to be able to have some mathematical ability, some literary ability, and also to have some vocabulary knowledge as well. Based on how an individual performed on this test, they would be categorized one of 5 different ways. An A score meant that you were a high officer type. A B score meant that you made a splendid sergeant material. So you had some leadership ability, but probably not at the highest level. A C level was a good private. A D was a fair soldier, though slow in learning. Again, these would be the individuals who probably were trained to be the foot soldiers, who would be the first wave going into battle. And then finally, an E was unfit for regular Army service. These individuals were not allowed to participate in combat activities. However, they could be accepted into positions stateside in which they were in labor positions in production of military arms, equipment, and resources. So I want to take a moment and have you look over some of these items. And as you look at some of these items, and you think about what the assessment was designed to do, does the content seem to match the position the instrument is slotting individuals into? Are these the types of facts, knowledge, and understanding an individual needs to have to be a strong tactician and military strategy expert? If you were to take this test, where would you slot? If you came from a background where you did not have much schooling, maybe you didn't even know how to read or write, how would you perform on this test? So there definitely is a much higher correlation between someone's socioeconomic status and access to educational resources than there may be to military prowess. Now, in speaking of those individuals who were not able to read or write, a version of this test was available for them as well. The beta test, the Army beta test, was the nonverbal component for individuals who did not have strong reading and writing abilities. The beta test presented individuals with a series of images, much like you see here. Individuals would have to indicate what was missing from the pictures as presented. So, in the first row, the first image is of a face, and it looks like the mouth is missing. Pictures 2 and 3 are side profiles. In 2, the woman's eye is missing. And in 3, the woman's nose is missing. In picture 4, it looks like the individual's hand, which is raised, is missing. And so you would go through and you would identify what's missing in each of these items. Now, as you can imagine, especially in wartime, the Army was testing hundreds and thousands of individuals. This data was being collected and a profile was being developed. In one of the first studies that emerged, which looked at over 2 million administrations of these tests, the results showed that the average mental age of adults was slightly higher than that for the age of moronity, which at the time was a mental age of 10 to 12. And so the early intelligence scales looked at descriptions of someone's mental age as being a moron with a mental age of 10 to 12, an imbecile, and then an idiot. Those were the classifications. What they also found were immigrants, particularly those with darker skin complexions from Southern Europe or Eastern Europe, were scoring lower than the fair-skinned individuals from Western and Northern Europe. Even below those groups, Black Americans were at the bottom with a mental age of 10.41, putting them right at the level of being an imbecile. The results of these studies shocked the public in several different ways. On one side of the debate, there was a lot of panic and hysteria that feeble-mindedness was much more prevalent than people had supposed, and this caused a moral panic. Psychologists, politicians, and the public alike saw this as the downfall of American society. These statistics became rallying points for eugenicists who predicted that the declining education we were seeing was caused by several factors, including unconstrained breeding of the poor and feeble-minded. Again, going back to that idea that we were allowing individuals with poor genetic inequalities to reproduce. Second was the spread of interracial marriages, which was diluting the intellectual ability of the fair skin. And third, the swamping of the intelligent native stock by the massive influx of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. So we have one side of the debate where individuals were in a panic that society was on the downfall, and it had much to do with the mixing and interspersing of races in America. On the other side, we see individuals like John B. Watson, one of the earlier behavioralists, and anthropologists like Franz Boas, who criticized these assumptions. They did not believe in the heredity presumptions of these intelligence tests. In fact, they spoke out frequently condemning intelligence tests as an engine of cruelty that was based upon the pretentious abuse of the scientific method. These tests, which were designed to eventually expand beyond a military perspective, that never occurred. The complete development of the test never got to a point where these tests became part of the public fabric in our education and our vocational trainings. Although the Army Alpha and Beta tests were eventually stopped, they were the precursor for continued testing of aptitude that the military does. The ASVAB military aptitude tests are based on the idea of being able to identify skill sets that individuals have and placing them in career paths and trajectories that match their abilities. After the war and the debate over intelligence and where it comes from, is it nature? Is it nurture? And what does it look like? There was a mass explosion of ideas and insights into what intelligence looked like. Between the 1920s and 1950s, several different prominent theories of intelligence debuted in the professional literature. And so intelligence testing was a field of constant development and updating. One of the first to look at how intelligence might be constructed was Charles Spearman. Spearman, who was somewhat of a Renaissance man in many different areas, his work in statistics and research led to the development of regression analyses and Spearman correlations, was also an experimental psychologist and an educational psychologist. Spearman looked at intelligence as being dichotomous. And there were two parts to intelligence. There was a G aspect and an S aspect. The G stood for general intelligence. It was a component that everybody had, albeit in varying degrees. But general intelligence made up the intelligence one would need to get through everyday life. The second component was the S, the specific intelligence. Individuals each had unique, specific intelligences. Think of you and your family or your friends. Are there things that you do well that they struggle at? Are there things that you see them do well that you can only dream of performing that way. Maybe someone is able to pick up an instrument and start playing it like an expert in no time at all. Other people are able to have artistic abilities that would seem completely foreign to another. These were all specific intelligences that Spearman talked about. And so he looked at the mind as being two vessels that we had: our general and our specific intelligence. Branching off from that is the work of E.L. Thorndike. Thorndike saw intelligence as being three separate areas. Thorndike saw intelligence being abstract, mechanical, and social in nature. The abstract was the ability to have cognitive processes, to be able to work out situations and deal with abstract knowledge and information. It was your reasoning ability. Mechanical intelligence dealt more with your manual dexterity, your ability to have hand-eye coordination, to be able to build things or do things with your hands. And then finally, social intelligence looked at your ability to engage others in interpersonal relationships. Again, take a moment and think of yourself, your family, and others. Are there some that you could look at and say, oh yes, that person is definitely an abstract, intelligent individual? Or, nope, that is a socially intelligent individual. Thorndike believed that everybody had all three of these, but they were on sliding scales. As one would go up, the others would go down. We weren't able, as human beings, to maintain high levels in all areas. We had a finite amount of energy and intelligence that directed itself into these areas. So if you were high in one, by extension, you were low in the others. Thurston took it even further. So Lewis Thurston identified 7 primary mental abilities. So we see a movement whereby intelligence and our understanding of intelligence becomes more nuanced. Rather than intelligence being a singular aspect, you either have it or you don't, we're seeing that intelligence is actually many different things. And individuals could be intelligent in some areas and less so in others. In Thurston's conceptualization, the 7 primary mental abilities that we have are verbal comprehension, word fluency, number facility, spatial visualization, associative memory, perceptual speed, and reasoning. Those 7 areas comprise intelligence. And then finally, and there are others, but these are the main individuals that I believe it would be important for you to be familiar with, is David Wexler. So David Wexler was a psychologist working at Bellevue Hospital. And while at the hospital, he started developing what he called his memory scales. Wechsler viewed intelligence as being an aggregate or global capacity of an individual to act purposefully, to think rationally, and to deal effectively with their environment. Wechsler's scales were developed in response to criticisms of the Stanford-Binet scale. The revisions of the Stanford-Binet scale, the most recent, which was coming out in 1937, was looking at children and disadvantaged situations. Again, still trying to place children who had the intellectual capacity to succeed versus those who maybe came from backgrounds that did not allow them to have the resources or the access needed to be successful. Wechsler found that problematic. He believed that it relied too much on book learning and what was learned in schools. He also believed that the test, since it was written for children, was a poor indicator of intelligence for adults. At the time, individuals were trying to use the Stanford-Binet scale for adults as well, and it was a screening tool for many of the mental health facilities at the time. So Wechsler's scale breaks down intelligence in this way. At the top of the hierarchy, there is a full-scale IQ score that an individual gets. But more important is to look at the second-order intelligences, verbal and performance. Here we see Wechsler's viewpoint that intelligence is more than just your book learning by including these performance aspects. These verbal and performance areas break down even further, and at the bottom you see the various sections of the test. So individuals who take the Wechsler scales will take subsections looking at vocabulary, similarities, information processing, comprehension, arithmetic, digital span, letter number sequencing, picture completions, block designs, matrix reasoning, digit symbol coding, and symbol searching. These are the different components of intelligence from Wechsler's point of view. So throughout the 20s and 50s, we see intelligence continually being redefined and reconceptualized as a much broader and more nuanced perspective. Currently, we're seeing intelligence being conceptualized many different ways, and as a result, new assessments are coming out that are looking at intelligence from these different perspectives. Intelligence is being discussed from the perspective of psychometric theories, cognitive theories, cognitive contextual theories, as well as biological theories. So really there is a lot going on looking at intelligence. And after some 100+ years of studying it, we still are not at a place where we have completely been able to identify what intelligence is, where it comes from, how it is stored or manifested, and what it allows us to do. So let's take a break from intelligence for a moment, and let's shift our focus to personality. In addition to intelligence, personality is probably one of the constructs that has most moved the assessment and measurement fields forward in the past 100 plus years. Personality testing became popular in the early 1900s. One of the first personality assessments was Robert Woodworth's personal data sheet. This was the first self-report personality inventory, where it could be given to an individual and they score their responses, turn it back into the researcher, who would then go through and come up with a result. Woodworth's test was developed during World War I. It was designed to detect soldiers who may be emotionally unfit for combat. It was never actually deployed for this use, as it too was not finished during the war. Another early approach was Carl Jung's word association inventory. This is one of the most fascinating psychological assessments. It's based on the idea that your subconscious is sometimes capable of controlling your conscious will. In his assessment, and we'll look at an example in a moment, a single word can be used to unleash past traumas or reveal unresolved internal conflicts that an individual might be going through. The test itself contains 100 stimulant words. The researcher would read these words to the patient. When each word was read, the patient would then have to say aloud the first thing that came to their mind. They were instructed to do this quickly and automatically without giving it much thought. In addition to recording their verbal response, Jung would look at other things as well. He would keep detailed records on the time it took to make a response, the rate of breathing, and the galvanic skin response that the individual exhibited. These tests would then be administered several times to develop a sort of test-retest consistency. Here's an example of the Woodworth personal data sheet. So as I mentioned, it has 116 questions. Here's a sample. And since it was self-report, individuals would just circle for themselves, yes or no, to these items. Now again, this instrument was initially developed as a military screening tool. So look at some of these items and think about responses that an individual would have to these yes or no responses, and how that may help you identify who would be unfit for the military. And then here are samples of Jung's word association inventory. Again, there are 100 different word stems, so here's just a few. These would be read aloud to the test taker, who would then need to quickly give their response. The idea being that that initial response that was unfiltered by thought or censorship would represent the unconscious of the individual. And these word stems would unlock any past traumas or repressed emotions or feelings that an individual would have. Scoring then looked at the type of response that an individual had. And so there were not correct answers or incorrect answers. Rather, it was the type of response an individual would have. And so scoring looks at whether individuals had a lot of repeating of the words. So for example, item number 2 is green. If the test taker responded with the word green, you would make a note of that. There were other categories that looked at, was the individual providing a definition of the term? Was the individual providing a variation of the term? So again, item 13, if the word is cold and the individual puts freezing or chilly, those are variations of that term. The items that were marked as being especially important to come back and discuss with the individual are those that then unlocked some of that subconscious thought. And that would come out in answers that seem to indicate that there was a past issue or a problem that the client was dealing with. Another popular early personality test is the Rorschach inkblot test. So Hermann Rorschach developed this test in the 19-teens. He actually was inspired by the popular European children's game Blotto, and also his work with Eugene Bleuler. All right, so Blotto was a popular children's game where kids were shown ink blots and they had to either create a word association, a song, a poem, or some type of acted out charade based on the ink blot. Bleuler was a Swiss psychiatrist. He served as Hermann Rorschach's dissertation chair. Bleuler, you may hear his name, was an early pioneer in psychiatry and psychiatric diagnoses. He coined such terms we use today as schizophrenia, schizoid, and autism. His work helped to identify what some of the distinguishing characteristics of those disorders are. Using some of Bleuler's ideas and what he remembered from the children's game, Rorschach came up with this projective psychological test. So a projective test, again, is one where there's not a right or wrong answer. It's designed to be ambiguous, to tap into what the individual is really thinking, feeling, or keeping pent up. He initially created 40 cards, but he only used 15 of them with most patients. And so he found a lot of clinical success, and so he tried to have his cards published so that they could be used by other researchers as well. But what he found was that the publishers, due to the expense of creating these cards, were only willing to publish a set of 10. So Rorschach had to go back to the drawing board and eliminate some cards and come up with the final 10 that he used. Those 10 cards had 5 that were in black and white and 5 that were in color. If you look at the cards, you'll note that amongst those that are in black and white, there is some shading areas where the black is actually more of a gray or a muted color. Those were not by design. Rorschach's initial cards were black and white only. The shading came in because of the quality of the printing press that created his first set of cards. It was an unintended accident, but Rorschach actually appreciated it because it gave another data point that could be assessed when individuals were looking at cards and responding to them. Now he was able to see how they were responding to the shaded components, if at all. So here's an example of an ink blot stimulus. This would be shared with an individual and they would be asked to describe what it is that they see. Since these are projective tests, there's no right or wrong answer for an individual to give. What the researcher would assess is the individual responding to the whole shape or just a component or partial area of the shape? Does the color or shading factor in to what they're describing or not? Is their description related to what they're seeing, or does it expand a story that either projects into the future or works backwards into the past? So as you see this image, what comes to mind for you? In modern applications, a list of popular responses are included with these cards so that you could see if responses that your particular client is giving are consistent with others who have been presented this card, or is it completely different than what people have thought of before? Completely different does not always mean a negative, but it could be a conversation starter in a future session. Here is another ink blot stimulus, this one adding color into the imagery. Again, you can see the black is a little bit muted in here, more of a gray. What do you see in this image? And the same process would apply of cataloging your response and what was gained from that response. Another popular projective test is the thematic apperception test. It was developed in 1935, and initially it included 31 cards. Individuals were shown these cards, and they were a series of pictures depicting a variety of ambiguous characters, scenes, or situations. And the individual was asked to tell a dramatic story based on the picture. That story was talking about what led up to the event being shown. What's actually happening in the scene that we're seeing right now? What's the outcome of the story? What are some of the thoughts and feelings these characters are going through in this situation? So of the 31 cards, initially a patient would see 20 of those. Today, when therapists use the thematic apperception test in their clinical work, they use between 5 and 12 cards with their clients. So here's an example of a thematic apperception test prompt. This image would be presented to a test taker, and you would ask them to tell you a story. What's going on in this scene? What happened previously that led up to this scene? What's the outcome or aftermath? Where are we going after this? And what are the players thinking and feeling? Okay. So take some time when you have a chance to look at this yourself. What is it that you see? What's the story that you would tell based on this image? Here's a second thematic apperception test prompt. Again, you would be looking at this image and you would be telling the story of what you see. Like the Rorschach and others before it, these projective tests are tapping into that unconscious mind of the individual and finding out what is really going on with them. Another popular personality assessment is the MMPI. It's the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. It was developed by researchers Hathaway and McKinley in the 1930s. Hathaway and McKinley were working at the University of Minnesota at the time. They wanted to come up with an empirical view of personality assessment. So, the idea being that these projective tests we have, while they may be helpful in giving us talking points or prompts to discuss in a clinical setting, they didn't allow for any type of empirical research to be conducted on an individual. And so, how did they come about this empirical view of personality assessment? Well, they started out with a large sample of non-categorized items. So they came up with a bunch of items tapping into several different personality domains that they didn't necessarily ascribe to any type of personality disorder, personality issue, or challenge. They gave these items to a large normative sample. That sample included both clinical and what they would call normal individuals. Normal individuals were those that did not have any psychiatric diagnosis. What they then did was they went through and looked at each individual item and cataloged how individuals performed on that item. And they tried to find, were there items that differentiated individuals who had specific disorders or psychiatric conditions apart from, again, the normal individuals who did not have any diagnoses. So, for example, if, say, randomly item 35 on the instrument was highly endorsed by everyone who had schizophrenia, but was not endorsed by people without a diagnosis of schizophrenia, and to a lesser extent by individuals who had other disorders, that item was then categorized as being something that measured schizophrenia. The initial MMPI was made up from a normative group of individuals who were from the Minnesota area. So the normal group was largely made up of white working class Midwestern farming communities. The clinical group was the individuals who were seeking treatment at University of Minnesota's hospital. The MMPI was quite popular and was used in many, many mental health treatment facilities. Still is quite popular today. In 1989, we had a revision of the MMPI. The MMPI-2 came out. The revision looked at a more diverse normative group. It had been nearly 60 years since the initial research was out. Society looks much different now than it did 60 years ago. The diversity in society is much different. And so in 1989, new norms were developed. In addition to these new norms, different scoring mechanisms were put in place. So while the MMPI has its set of clinical scales, which we'll look at in a moment, several different scoring mechanisms have been developed which look at patterns or relationships between scores on multiple scales to create what we call these syndromes that individuals could have. The MMPI is going through another revision now. The new version, MMPI 3, will be available this fall. The new version, which we'll talk about in a moment, has some exciting new additions to it. And then finally, in 1992, an adolescent version was created to expand the age group for which assessment can be completed. So here are the initial clinical scales on the MMPI. These were identified as the major psychiatric conditions for which individuals were receiving treatment or being hospitalized in the early part of the 1900s. And you can see the number of items from their initial item pool that loaded on each of these scales. The MMPI is by no means a short measure. It's over 500 items that an individual responds to. As I measure the MMPI 3, which is coming out this fall, there is a new nationally representative normative sample of over 1,600 individuals. So the norm sample represents the 2010 U.S. Census demographic makeups. There is also a normative sample of Spanish speakers. So now, if you are working with clients whose native language is Spanish, you could give them a Spanish version of the instrument, and they could be normed to similar Spanish speakers. There was an updating of items to improve the context and the vocabulary to be more current, and 72 new items were added. With the addition of these new items and the revisions, there are new scales as well. So in addition to the clinical scales and the different externalizing and interpersonal scales, we now have scales looking at eating concerns, compulsivity, impulsivity, and self-importance. The score reports that come out from the MMPI 3 will now provide a wealth of information that can be used in many, many different ways in working with clients. In addition to the standard validity scales, which give you a sense of whether a client was legitimately responding to these items, trying to fake good or fake bad, or being inconsistent in their responses, you also will have information on the Big Five personality inventories, the higher order and the new clinically restructured scales. You will have the somatic, cognitive, and internalizing scales, the interpersonal and externalizing scales, as well as item level information. So a large report comes out for individuals, with a typical report being in the 18 to 25 page length. So that represents, the MMPI represents a shift from the more projective tests to a more empirically based test. And several other popular personality tests follow this format as well. The Personality Assessment Inventory, the PAI, the California Personality Inventory, the CPI, all of these follow a similar approach. So where does that leave us today, and where are we going in the future? Some of the current challenges in assessment that we have. Being able to recognize individualization, that creating exams, especially when we're using them in selection, is difficult. Creating an examination or an assessment that is unbiased and equitable to everyone who takes it is impossible. So as this cartoon illustrates, everyone's taking the same exam. They have to climb the tree. Some people in this group of animals here are going to be quite pleased. They're going to have a high chance of success on this test. Others, the fish in the bowl, probably not so much. And so a challenge we have is coming up with assessments that could be used that take into account individuality, but are still practical and can be used in multiple situations. A second challenge that we have is high-stakes testing, particularly in our educational settings. If you work in education, you hear this a lot. If you have children in schools, you are quite familiar with this. Schools and school officials and teachers teaching to the test and the importance of students' scores on a test. And what you see being comically illustrated here is true in many cases. You have state departments and school districts really putting pressure on schools that if your numbers don't increase, it's going to look bad for your community. It's going to negatively impact the funding that you will receive. You have teachers and administrators who are fearful that they will be out of jobs if students don't perform well. And then all of that pressure trickles down to the student who's taking the test, and how that pressure negatively impacts their performance. So the idea of high-stakes testing is actually hotly debated in states all over the country. In some areas, progressive ideas are coming forward to look at other ways to assess students other than these standardized tests. In other areas, it's actually a doubling down of the importance of these tests, where schools will now be considered looking at personnel decisions based on student performance. In other words, teachers being able to maintain their jobs or being eligible for merit raises based on the test scores of their students. So do we end up educating youth, or do we educate youth on how to take a test? A big issue we see in assessment today. A third current challenge we see is the idea of computer adaptive testing. As technology has increased and computers are playing a much larger role in the administration of tests, we see computer adaptive testing. Computer adaptive testing is a type of testing that uses algorithms and current real-time performance of an individual to adjust the difficulty of the test based on how someone is performing. So you may have taken some of these tests yourself. In these type of tests, if you are doing well, questions will start to get progressively more and more difficult until you reach your ceiling level of where your ability or knowledge or whatever the test is assessing seems to tap out. If you're performing poorly, the system will activate item generation so that the test taker starts to receive easier items and then builds back up. Much of the science behind these algorithms and these decision point processes, as do the types of questions that individuals get, are still being developed and finalized. And so there's still a lot to understand about the true value and utility of computer adaptive testing. And finally, we see assessment now taking advantage of modern technology and medical advances, where we're able to harness what we know about neuroscience and use technologies such as functional MRIs or EEGs to look at brain activity and start to identify different components of the brain that are related to different intellectual tasks and functioning, and how stimulation to those areas or impairment in those areas may be affecting performance or ability. And so all of these new advances are changing the way we're looking at assessment, no longer having to have paper and pencil tests, no longer having to rely on observation. We are now able to take those approaches and supplement them with more empirical, science-based information. Whether that is helpful to the profession or detracts from our more humanistic foundation of the profession is yet to be seen. These are new developments that are still emerging and still being integrated into counseling practice and assessment practices. So this was a quick overview of assessment throughout the years. We looked at some major milestones, figures, and events across a continuum of several thousand years in a brief time here. So this hopefully provides you with an understanding of how we got to where we are today in terms of assessment, how assessment has been used by societies, both in a positive manner and also with some potentially dubious rationales behind it. Some of the ways that assessment has been used in a way that protects individuals and provides an equitable experience for them, and other ways where the examinations and assessments themselves were inherently biased and prejudiced against certain groups from the beginning. Looking at it collectively, though, we see great progress has been made in our knowledge of individuals and how we could better understand who they are and what they are capable of.